They served my favorite cheesecake. My sister Emma played piano while the relatives gathered around. My mother said it was a family celebration to welcome me back from another failed adventure, but I knew exactly what it was. A public shaming disguised as support, where I was the cautionary tale they needed everyone to see. I'm Commander Victoria Hayes. My family tried to humiliate me by calling me a failure. What they didn't expect was that I'd already proven them wrong in waters they'd never understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That evening, in front of 22 family members who'd driven from 3 states to witness what my father called Victoria's latest reality check, they delivered their verdict on my 12 years in the Navy. Victoria's finally ready to admit that this military experiment hasn't worked out, my father announced, raising his coffee cup like he was toasting a recovery from gambling addiction. Ready to come home and build a stable career like her sister. The room murmured approvingly. Aunt Margaret smiled like I had just confessed to a gambling problem I was finally ready to address. Uncle Frank patted my shoulder like I'd survived a cult and found my way back to civilization. They all looked at me in my civilian clothes, a simple dress Emma had picked out, as if my naval uniform had been a costume from a phase I'd finally outgrown. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because they genuinely believed I'd taken emergency leave from my deployment to announce my surrender to their suburban expectations. Like I was still that confused 22-year-old who'd joined the Navy because she couldn't handle real college, not the officer who'd spent the last 5 years commanding vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The laughter died when my mother pulled out a thick binder, meticulously organized with printed job listings and career transition guides. Administrative assistant positions, customer service management, bank teller training programs, all the realistic careers she'd researched for daughters who'd finally stopped playing sailor. "I've been networking," she said, her voice carrying that tone of maternal authority mixed with disappointed resignation. "Patricia Chen's company is expanding their operations department. They're willing to interview someone with leadership experience, even if it's unconventional." I stared at the binder. Inside were highlighted salary ranges that were a fraction of my current Navy pay, benefit packages that couldn't compete with military healthcare, and job descriptions that made my soul ache with their mind-numbing predictability. Data entry, team coordination, client relations. Words that meant nothing to someone who'd coordinated fleet movements across 3 oceans. "What if I'm not ready to transition out?" I asked carefully. My father's expression hardened. "Victoria, you're 34 years old. You've been in the Navy for 12 years and you're still not an admiral. Face facts. If you were going to succeed in the military, it would have happened by now. Still not an admiral." Like becoming an admiral was the only measure of naval success. Like the hundreds of sailors I'd led, and the critical missions I'd completed meant nothing if I hadn't reached the absolute pinnacle of military hierarchy. "You've given it a good try," my mother added, her voice gentler but no less devastating. "But Emma has her master's degree and a corner office downtown. She's building something real, something permanent. This military thing, it's time to be honest about what it is. A failure." That was the word they couldn't quite say but hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I was 34, unmarried, still moving from base to base like some kind of professional nomad, still playing dress-up in a uniform while my younger sister built what they considered a real life. Emma stopped playing piano. The room went quiet except for the sound of coffee cups being set down on saucers and the distant hum of my father's expectations finally being voiced after years of polite disappointment. "So here's what we've decided," my father continued. "You're going to submit your resignation papers, take the transition assistance the Navy offers, and start fresh. It's not giving up, Victoria, it's growing up." The silence stretched until my father leaned back in his chair, wearing that calculated expression he used when he was about to deliver what he considered his winning argument. "Of course, Victoria, if you're not ready to think practically about your own future, maybe you should consider what this is doing to Emma." My stomach dropped. I looked across the room at my sister, who had stopped playing piano and was now arranging sheet music, with the focused concentration of someone trying to become invisible. Emma, who'd written me letters every month during my deployments, who'd defended my career choice to relatives who whispered about my extended adolescence, who'd been the only family member to attend my promotion ceremony to commander. What does Emma have to do with my career decisions? I asked, though I could already sense the trap closing. My father smiled, the same calculating smile he'd worn when he'd convinced my mother to co-sign for his failed restaurant venture, when he'd talked his way into managing my grandmother's estate. Well, Emma's been seeing someone, a very promising young man actually, works in finance, comes from an excellent family. Emma's hands stilled on the piano keys. Her shoulders tensed in a way that told me this conversation had happened before, without me present. Robert's family is very traditional, my mother added, her voice carefully neutral, very concerned with stability and reputation. When Emma mentioned that her sister was still in the military at 34, unmarried, constantly deployed to dangerous places, they had concerns, my father finished. About what that says about our family's values, about the kind of household Emma was raised in. I felt the world tilt slightly. Are you saying that my naval career is somehow affecting Emma's relationship? I'm saying that Robert's parents have specifically mentioned their discomfort with having a career military officer in the family, my father replied. They question whether Emma comes from a family that prioritizes traditional values and stability. Emma finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria, I never asked them to. Of course you didn't, my father interrupted. But the reality is that your sister's continued military service is creating problems for your relationship. Robert's family sees it as a red flag, a sign of instability and poor decision-making. I stared at Emma, really seeing her for the first time that evening. 28 years old, brilliant, successful in her own right, but sitting there like she was waiting for permission to breathe. Emma had always been the golden child, the one who'd followed the expected path, earned the approved degrees, chosen the acceptable career. Emma, I said carefully, is this what you want? For me to leave the Navy so your boyfriend's family will approve of you? She looked up then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of disappointing people. Fear of losing approval. Fear of being judged by association with a sister who'd chosen duty over convention. I just want to be happy, she whispered. And Robert he's everything I thought I wanted. Stable, successful, safe. But his family thinks military service is inappropriate for women, my mother explained. They believe it shows a lack of proper feminine values and family priorities. They're worried about what kind of influence you might have on Emma, what kind of example you're setting. My father leaned forward, delivering his knockout punch. So here's the situation, Victoria. Either you submit your resignation and show Robert's family that you're capable of making mature, responsible decisions, or Emma loses the best relationship she's ever had because her sister can't let go of playing sailor. I looked at Emma again. Sweet, talented Emma, who'd sacrificed her own dreams before to keep peace in the family, who'd chosen practical over passionate every time someone pushed her toward safety. Emma, who deserved to be loved for who she was, not condemned for who her sister had become. They're good people, Emma said quietly. Robert's family. They don't understand why someone would choose military life when there are other options. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'm 34 years old. I've been serving in the United States Navy for 12 years, ever since I graduated from college with a degree in marine engineering and a burning desire to prove that women could excel in the most demanding maritime environments. In my family, success was measured by stability and social acceptance. Daughters were supposed to find secure desk jobs, marry upwardly mobile men, and produce grandchildren who would reflect well on the family name. My father, Richard Hayes, had built his identity around being a successful small business owner who understood real-world economics. He'd owned a series of moderately successful ventures, a hardware store, a small construction company, a restaurant that lasted 18 months, and considered himself an expert on practical career decisions. He measured worth by profit margins and local reputation, by how impressive your job sounded at neighborhood barbecues and high school reunions. In his world, military service was something idealistic young people did before they grew up and joined the real economy. It was noble in theory but impractical in reality. especially for women who should be focused on building families rather than playing soldier. The idea that someone might preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Build a lifelong career around naval service, might find purpose and identity in maritime leadership, was completely foreign to his understanding of success. My mother, Patricia, had been a teacher before she married my father and became a full-time homemaker and business partner. She measured her success by how well her daughters conformed to social expectations. A daughter in the military wasn't just unconventional. It was a personal reflection of her failure to raise a girl who understood her proper role in society. Growing up, I'd watched the way my parents treated achievement. When Emma won academic honors and leadership positions in college organizations, they threw parties and called relatives. When I earned athletic scholarships and ROTC commendations, they smiled politely and asked when I was going to get serious about my future. Academic and social achievements were valuable because they led to appropriate marriages and respectable careers. Military accomplishments were just expensive hobbies that distracted from real-life goals. I joined the Navy partly because I loved the technical challenges of maritime engineering, but mostly because I was drawn to an environment where competence mattered more than connections. In the Navy, nobody cared whether your father owned businesses or your mother knew the right people. They cared whether you could navigate complex situations, whether you could lead sailors through dangerous waters, whether your crew could depend on you when everything went wrong. The Navy had given me everything my family couldn't: clear standards, meaningful responsibility, and advancement based on performance rather than politics. When I excelled, I got promoted. When I showed leadership potential, I got command opportunities. When I proved myself in critical situations, I earned respect that meant something beyond social approval. Over 12 years, I'd risen from ensign to commander. I'd completed 4 deployments, earned multiple commendations for leadership under pressure, and been selected for increasingly complex command positions that less than 3% of naval officers ever achieved. I'd commanded vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars, led crews of hundreds of sailors, and coordinated operations that affected international maritime security. But every time I came home, I became Victoria the disappointment again. Victoria who'd chosen danger over safety, service over salary, duty over domesticity. Victoria who was getting older without getting married, who was becoming more masculine and hardened with each deployment, who was wasting her potential on a career that would never lead to the suburban stability my parents valued. The Navy had words for people who understood this kind of service: officers, leaders, professionals. My family had different words: stubborn, unrealistic, selfish. In their world, a woman who could manage complex naval operations and navigate international waters was somehow less valuable than one who could manage a household and navigate social expectations. They didn't see the commendations from superior officers, the letters from sailors I'd mentored, the critical missions completed under my command. They saw a daughter who'd forgotten her place, who'd chosen respect from strangers over approval from family. This wasn't the first time my father had used family dynamics to control career decisions that threatened his worldview. I'd watched him orchestrate similar campaigns before, methodically and effectively, against anyone who dared to pursue paths he couldn't understand or respect. My cousin Rachel had wanted to be a marine biologist. She'd been accepted to graduate programs at 3 different universities, had research opportunities lined up, even had a mentor at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But my father convinced her parents that marine science was impractical and financially unstable. He presented them with statistics about academic job markets and horror stories about PhD students who never found permanent positions. Rachel ended up in accounting instead. She still keeps aquarium fish in her apartment, but there's a sadness in her eyes when she talks about practical choices and realistic expectations. My brother-in-law Kevin had dreams of becoming a professional musician. He'd been good enough to tour with regional bands, had even gotten interest from a record label. But when he started dating my cousin Lisa, my father pulled him aside with spreadsheets about the music industry's failure rates and lectures about providing stability for a family. Kevin became an insurance adjuster. He still plays guitar at family gatherings, but only when specifically requested, and he never plays his own compositions anymore. Even my mother had been a victim, though she'd never acknowledge it. Before she married my father, she'd wanted to pursue a master's degree in education and possibly become a principal or administrator. But my father had convinced her that advanced education was unnecessary for women, and that her real calling was supporting his business ventures and raising his children. She gave up her academic aspirations to become the perfect supportive wife, managing his books and handling customer relations while her own intellectual dreams withered in silence. I'd thought I was safe because I'd already established my independence. I'd built a career outside his sphere of influence, earned achievements he couldn't diminish, created a life he couldn't directly control. But I'd underestimated his long-term strategy and his willingness to use emotional manipulation. Emma represented everything I'd never been in his eyes: compliant, conventional, safely predictable. Where I'd been questioning and independent, Emma was agreeable and sought approval. Where I'd chosen a career path he couldn't understand, Emma had pursued exactly the kind of respectable professional life he valued. She was his success story, proof that his parenting philosophy worked when daughters listened to reason. And now Emma was showing signs of potential instability, not because of her own choices, but because of her association with me. My continued naval service wasn't just a personal rebellion anymore. It was threatening to contaminate his perfect daughter by association. The pattern was becoming clear. My father didn't just disagree with unconventional career choices, he was threatened by them. Each family member who succeeded outside his approved parameters challenged his position as the authority on life decisions. My naval achievements didn't just prove that military service could be successful, they proved that his understanding of success was incomplete. But there was something darker that I was starting to recognize. My father's dismissal of my career wasn't based on genuine concern for my well-being. It was based on his need to be right about women's proper roles. He'd been telling people for 12 years that I was wasting my potential, that military service was inappropriate for women, that I'd eventually come to my senses and pursue a normal life. My continued success made him look foolish. Every promotion I earned, every commendation I received, every leadership position I was selected for, was evidence that he'd been wrong about military careers, wrong about women's capabilities, wrong about what constituted real achievement. If I resigned now, he could claim victory. He could tell everyone that he'd been right all along, that military service was ultimately unsustainable, that daughters who listened to their father's wisdom eventually found their way back to appropriate choices. But if I continued serving, if I kept achieving, if I proved that naval leadership was not only sustainable but exceptional, then his entire worldview about women's roles and capabilities would be publicly, permanently undermined. Emma wasn't really the issue. My career wasn't really the issue. The issue was my father's desperate need to be the authority on what women could and should achieve, and my refusal to validate his limitations. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, listening to the sound of waves from the harbor 3 miles away, a sound that had called to me since I was 8 years old, dreaming of commanding ships and exploring distant waters. For the first time in my naval career, I felt truly cornered. Not by enemy forces or impossible missions, but by the realization that I couldn't protect the person I loved most without sacrificing everything I'd worked for. My father had chosen his battlefield perfectly: family loyalty versus personal integrity. Resign and save Emma's relationship, or continue serving and watch him systematically destroy her happiness, the same way he'd destroyed so many other dreams in our family. But as I stared at the ceiling, something shifted in my tactical thinking. I'd spent 12 years learning to navigate complex situations, to find strategic advantages in scenarios that seemed hopeless. My father thought he held all the leverage, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated what I'd learned about leadership, diplomacy, and the power of undeniable evidence. I couldn't fight him directly. That would only confirm his narrative about military service making women aggressive and unfeminine. I couldn't argue with him using emotion. He'd already dismissed 12 years of documented achievements as playing sailor. But maybe I could outmaneuver him using something he'd never see coming: the very system he was trying to force me to abandon. The next morning, I found Emma in the kitchen, mechanically making coffee while our parents got ready for work. Her shoulders were rigid with the kind of tension that comes from sleepless nights and impossible choices. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. Emma looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. If you're going to tell me that you're right to choose your career over my happiness, just save it. I heard the message loud and clear last night. Actually, I wanted to tell you about something that happened during my last deployment, I said, settling into the chair across from her. We had a situation that seemed impossible. Pirates had taken control of shipping lanes, international trade was being disrupted, and every conventional response would have escalated the conflict. Emma's interest flickered despite her exhaustion. What did you do? I realized that sometimes you can't win by fighting the battle your opponent wants you to fight. You have to change the rules of engagement entirely. I leaned forward. Emma, what if I told you there was a way for me to continue my naval career and actually make Robert's family respect rather than fear it? That's impossible. They think military women are unstable. They think that because they don't understand what naval leadership actually involves. But what if they could see it firsthand? What if they could meet the kind of people I work with, understand the level of responsibility I handle, witness the respect I've earned from some of the most accomplished officers in the Navy? Emma stared at me. You mean prove them wrong instead of hiding from their judgment? More than that. I mean showing them that naval service isn't about abandoning feminine values. It's about expanding what those values can accomplish. I pulled out my phone and showed Emma something I'd been keeping secret. I've been offered a promotion, Emma. Fleet Operations Commander, Pacific Division. It's one of the highest strategic positions a commander can hold. What does that mean? It means I would coordinate naval operations across the entire Pacific theater. It means admirals seek my input on international maritime strategy. It means the Pentagon considers me essential personnel for some of the most sensitive operations in the Navy. Emma's jaw dropped. And Dad doesn't know? Dad doesn't know because I haven't decided whether to accept. The position comes with certain requirements that would make it impossible for me to resign for several years. It would effectively end any possibility of me following his career advice. Why haven't you accepted? I looked at my sister, really looked at her. 28 years old, brilliant, accomplished in her own right, but sitting there like she was apologizing for existing. Because I was afraid of what it would cost our relationship. But I'm starting to realize that some things are worth fighting for, even when the people you love can't initially understand why. Emma was quiet for a moment, then something shifted in her expression. A flicker of the determination I remembered from when we were kids. What if Robert's family could meet the Admiral who recommended you for this position? What do you mean? I mean, what if instead of hiding your achievements, we made them impossible to ignore? What if we invited them to see exactly what kind of officer their potential daughter-in-law's sister actually is? I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt since coming home. Emma, that's brilliant. But are you sure you're ready for what that might mean? She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time in years, I saw our father's determination in her eyes, but directed towards something he'd never approve of. Victoria, I'm tired of apologizing for having an extraordinary sister. Maybe it's time Robert's family learned what that actually means. Over the next 4 days, I taught Emma everything I knew about strategic presentation and tactical patience. Not naval tactics, family tactics. How to present information in ways that commanded respect rather than defensiveness. How to build cases that were logically unassailable. How to make people reconsider assumptions they'd held for years. The key, I explained as we sat in her apartment with her laptop open to Naval Command structure documentation, is understanding your audience's values. Robert's family doesn't respect military service because they don't understand what modern naval leadership actually involves. So we don't lead with military. We lead with responsibility, leadership, and international diplomacy. Emma caught on quickly. Within 2 hours, she'd created a presentation that would impress any corporate executive. Fleet Operations Commander responsibilities, overseeing operations worth billions of dollars, strategic coordination requirements, managing resources across multiple countries, leadership scope, directing operations involving thousands of personnel across international waters. This is incredible, she said, scrolling through research about Pacific Fleet operations. But what about actually meeting the people you work with? How do we make this real for them? That's when I told her about the network I'd been building without realizing it. Not just naval officers, but the kind of accomplished women who'd faced similar family skepticism about military careers and found ways to change minds through undeniable evidence. There was Captain Michelle Torres, whose family had staged an intervention similar to mine, convinced she was, quote, wasting her engineering degree on naval service. Michelle had invited them to a ceremony where she received recognition from the Secretary of the Navy for her innovations in maritime technology. Her parents now introduce her as, quote, the naval engineer who advises the Pentagon. Commander Sarah Kim, whose traditional Korean family had been mortified by her military career until they attended a diplomatic reception where she served as liaison between American and South Korean naval forces. Watching their daughter coordinate international maritime strategy had completely transformed their understanding of what naval service could mean. Admiral Rebecca Martinez, who'd overcome decades of family disapproval by systematically demonstrating that naval leadership required every skill they claimed to value: strategic thinking, financial management, international relations, crisis management under pressure. You see, I explained to Emma, they all stopped trying to defend military service in abstract terms. Instead, they created opportunities for their families to witness their actual responsibilities and achievements firsthand. Emma leaned forward, understanding dawning in her eyes. So we don't argue with Robert's family about whether naval careers are worthwhile. We show them evidence they can't dismiss or misinterpret. Exactly. And the Fleet Operations Commander position I've been offered comes with certain opportunities that would be very difficult for anyone to overlook. I showed Emma the full scope of what I'd been keeping secret. Fleet Operations Commander wasn't just a promotion. It came with responsibilities that required briefing civilian officials, coordinating with international allies, and managing operations that regularly appeared in national security news. When you're responsible for maritime operations affecting 3 different allies and billion-dollar shipping routes, I said, it becomes very hard for anyone to dismiss your work as, quote, playing sailor. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what I was showing her. But accepting this position means you can't resign, doesn't it? It means committing to naval service for years, regardless of what Dad wants. It means choosing my career over family approval, permanently and publicly. Emma looked at me with something like admiration mixed with determination. Victoria, what if Robert's family could attend your promotion ceremony? What if they could meet Admiral Thompson, the one who recommended you? I felt something shift in my chest, hope mixed with tactical excitement. Emma, that's brilliant. But are you prepared for what that might mean? If Robert's family sees the level of respect I've earned, if they understand the scope of my responsibilities, they can't continue dismissing naval service as inappropriate for women. Then maybe, Emma said with the first real smile I'd seen from her in months, it's time they learned what having a fleet commander in the family actually means. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My mother, who'd been conspicuously quiet since the family intervention, appeared at Emma's apartment 3 nights later carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had been hidden for years. I need to show you both something, she said, her voice shaking as she settled onto Emma's couch. Something I should have shared a long time ago, but your father made me promise to keep quiet. Inside the portfolio were documents I'd never seen before. Copies of naval commendations dating back to my 2nd year of service. Letters from commanding officers praising my leadership during critical operations. Performance evaluations that used words like exceptional, outstanding, and recommend for immediate advancement. My mother had been secretly requesting copies of my military records for over a decade. Mom, I whispered, staring at a letter from a rear admiral commending my coordination of a humanitarian rescue operation in the Philippines. Why didn't you ever tell me you had these? Because your father convinced me that encouraging your military career would only make it harder for you to transition to real life when you finally came to your senses, she said, tears starting to fall. But Victoria, I need you to understand something. When I gave up my education to support your father's business ventures, I told myself it was because his success was more important than my individual ambitions. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of failing, scared of not being good enough, scared of disappointing people who expected me to choose family over career. She pulled out another document, a classified after-action report for my deployment to the South China Sea, detailing how I'd successfully de-escalated a potentially explosive international incident through strategic coordination with Allied forces. When I read about what you accomplished during that crisis, about how you prevented what could have become an international conflict, I realized that you'd become everything I was too afraid to try to be. Emma leaned forward, reading over my shoulder. Victoria, this says you coordinated operations involving forces from 4 different countries. You were 29 years old. My mother nodded. Your father isn't just wrong about naval service being a waste of potential girls. He's terrified of what Victoria has accomplished because it exposes the limitations of his own understanding of success. She showed us more documents, letters from sailors I'd mentored, describing how my leadership had shaped their careers. Intelligence briefings, where my strategic assessments had influenced operational decisions at the highest levels. Performance reviews that consistently ranked me in the top 1% of officers at my level. Your father spent 20 years building small businesses that employed a handful of people, my mother continued. Victoria has spent 12 years earning the trust of admirals, the respect of international allies, and the responsibility for operations that affect global maritime security. Do you understand why that threatens everything he believes about women's capabilities? The pieces started falling into place. This wasn't about Emma's relationship or my career choices. This was about my father's fundamental inability to accept that his daughter had achieved things he could never understand, let alone accomplish himself. There's more, my mother said, pulling out the last document in the portfolio. It was a confidential assessment from Admiral Thompson, marked Personnel Evaluation, Confidential. How did you get this? I contacted Admiral Thompson directly and requested a complete evaluation of your career potential and current standing, she said. I may have given up my own ambitions, but I never stopped knowing how to research. I read the document with growing amazement. It wasn't just a performance review. It was a comprehensive analysis of my strategic capabilities, leadership effectiveness, and potential for advancement to the highest levels of naval command. Victoria, my mother said softly, do you know what Admiral Thompson wrote about your qualifications for Fleet Operations Commander? I shook my head, still processing what I was reading. He wrote that you demonstrate exceptional strategic thinking, unparalleled crisis management capabilities, and the kind of innovative leadership that defines the future of naval operations. He specifically recommended you for positions that typically require 15 to 20 years of experience. Emma stared at the document. Dad calls her a failure who's wasting her potential. But the Admiral considers her one of the most promising officers of her generation. That night, staring at the classified documents my mother had somehow obtained, I realized that defending my worth to my father wasn't enough anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. I had achieved things he could never dismiss, earned respect he could never diminish, and been selected for positions that represented the pinnacle of naval leadership. But I also understood now that his contempt for my service wasn't based on ignorance. It was based on fear. Fear that his definition of success was fundamentally incomplete. Fear that 12 years of naval leadership represented achievements far beyond his 20 years of small business management. Fear that his daughter had outgrown his ability to understand or control her value. I needed a plan that would expose not just my achievements, but the fundamental dishonesty of his entire worldview about women's capabilities in military service. And I knew exactly when and how to do it. Robert's family had planned a formal dinner for the following weekend, an opportunity for them to get to know Emma better and assess whether she came from an appropriate family. It was essentially a social audit disguised as hospitality, where they would evaluate everything from our manners to our values to our career choices. My father had already been preparing talking points, rehearsing ways to minimize my military service while emphasizing Emma's conventional success. He'd been coaching my mother on how to redirect conversations away from my career and toward topics that wouldn't raise red flags about our family's stability. But what my father didn't know was that Admiral Thompson was scheduled to be in town that same weekend for a Navy League dinner, an annual event where senior naval officers met with civilian leaders to discuss maritime strategy and defense priorities. And thanks to my security clearance and role in Pacific operations, I had been invited to attend as his aide-de-camp. More than invited, I had been specifically requested to present briefing materials on fleet coordination strategies to an audience that would include several congressmen and the Secretary of the Navy. I spent the next week carefully orchestrating every detail. I reached out to Captain Torres, Commander Kim, and Admiral Martinez, explaining my situation and asking for their support. They didn't just agree to help. They volunteered to participate in what we started calling Operation Family Enlightenment. Your father needs to understand that dismissing naval leadership means dismissing some of the most accomplished women in America, Admiral Martinez said during our planning conference call. And maybe it's time he learned that lesson in front of people whose opinions he actually values. The plan was elegant in its precision. I would attend Robert's family dinner as expected, playing the role of the dutiful sister supporting Emma's relationship. But I would also arrange for the dinner to coincide with a chance encounter with Admiral Thompson and other senior officers attending the Navy League event. Emma helped me prepare the materials, her natural intelligence making our case unassailable. We compiled testimonials from sailors I had led, commendations from superior officers, and detailed documentation of operations I'd planned and executed. But most importantly, we prepared a presentation comparing the scope of my naval responsibilities with traditional corporate leadership roles. 12 years of naval service had earned me authority over operations worth billions of dollars, leadership of thousands of personnel, and strategic responsibilities affecting international relations. My father's business experience, while respectable, involved managing small teams and local market challenges. The beautiful thing, Emma observed as we reviewed our materials, is that we're not challenging Robert's family's values. We're using their own criteria: responsibility, authority, international scope, strategic impact, to demonstrate why naval leadership commands respect. The final piece was accepting the Fleet Operations Commander position. Not quietly, the way I'd been considering, but publicly, with full ceremonial honors, in a promotion ceremony that would be impossible for anyone to ignore or misinterpret. I called Admiral Thompson and accepted the position, requesting that the announcement ceremony be scheduled for the week after Robert's family dinner. Then I arranged for local media coverage and invitations to be sent to selected community leaders. Cough. My father wanted to control the narrative about my career? Fine. But he was about to discover that some achievements are too significant, too well documented, and too widely respected to be diminished by family politics. The dinner at Robert's family estate was exactly what I'd expected. 12 people seated around a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars, discussing safe topics like real estate values and vacation destinations. Robert's parents, Charles and Margaret Whitfield, held court with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being the most important voices in any room. For the first hour, I played my role perfectly. I smiled when they asked about my plans for the future. I nodded when they suggested the importance of stability and family values. I even thanked them when Margaret mentioned knowing several companies that, quote, value leadership experience, even from unconventional backgrounds. My father was in his element, steering conversations away from my military service and toward Emma's corporate achievements. Emma's been promoted twice in 3 years, he said proudly. Real advancement, real responsibility in the business world. But when Charles Whitfield began his annual monologue about the importance of traditional family structures and appropriate career choices for women, I knew it was time. That's fascinating, Mr. Whitfield, I said, setting down my wine glass. Speaking of career choices, I have some news to share. The table went quiet. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me, expecting another announcement about my transition to civilian life. I've been promoted, I said, pulling out my phone to show the official notification. Fleet Operations Commander, Pacific Division. It's a strategic position coordinating naval operations across the entire Pacific Theater. Robert's father's smile faltered slightly. Victoria, this really isn't the appropriate. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, I think it's exactly the appropriate time, I interrupted, standing to address the entire table. See, I've been listening to everyone discuss career achievements and family values, and I realized I should probably clarify what I actually do for a living. I pulled up the presentation Emma and I had prepared. This position requires top-secret clearance approved by the Secretary of Defense. There are currently 8 people in the entire Navy authorized for Pacific Fleet Operations Coordination. The maritime operations I oversee involve assets worth over $50 billion and personnel from 7 different allied nations. Margaret Whitfield looked confused, but Richard said you were leaving the military. Richard said I was wasting my potential in the military, my father corrected, his voice tight with warning. Playing sailor instead of building a meaningful career. That's when my phone rang. It was Admiral Thompson, calling exactly as we'd planned. I answered on speaker, as if it were a routine call I couldn't avoid. Commander Hayes, this is Admiral Thompson. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but I need to brief you on tomorrow's Pentagon meeting. The Joint Chiefs want your assessment of the South China Sea situation before we meet with the Secretary of Defense. The dining room was dead silent now. Yes, sir. I'll have the strategic analysis ready for review by 0800. Outstanding. Also, congratulations on the Fleet Commander announcement. The entire Pacific Command is honored to have you in this role. Your innovative approaches to maritime coordination have revolutionized how we think about modern naval strategy. I hung up and looked around the table. 12 faces stared back at me, processing what they'd just heard. Charles Whitfield cleared his throat. Did he just say you briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Among other responsibilities, yes, Margaret leaned forward. And the Secretary of Defense knows who you are? We've briefed together on several occasions. Robert, who'd been silent throughout dinner, finally spoke. Victoria, I had no idea. Emma never mentioned that you were involved in anything so significant. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. Robert, meet my sister. She's not just in the Navy, she's one of the people who run it. My father sat frozen, watching 12 years of dismissive narratives crumble in real time. So, I said, sitting back down, anyone have questions about career trajectories and family values? The drive home from Robert's family dinner was the longest 30 minutes of my life. My father sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the harbor lights, while my mother drove in careful silence. Emma and Robert followed in his car, probably having conversations I could only imagine. My father didn't speak for 4 days, not because he was angry. I'd seen his anger before, and this was different. This was the silence of someone whose fundamental understanding of success, authority, and family dynamics had been completely restructured in front of people whose opinions actually mattered to him. When he finally approached me, it was on Thursday evening as I prepared for my return to base. He stood in my doorway for a long moment, holding a newspaper clipping I hadn't seen. The Whitfields called your mother yesterday, he said quietly. Charles wanted to know if you'd be willing to speak at their company's leadership conference next month. I looked up from packing my dress uniform. What did you tell them? I told them they'd have to ask you directly because apparently I don't understand what you do well enough to speak for you. He handed me the newspaper clipping. This was in today's business section. It was an article about the Navy League dinner, featuring a photo of me briefing congressional representatives alongside Admiral Thompson. The headline read, Local Naval Officer Selected for Elite Pacific Command Role. Margaret Whitfield sent this to half her social circle, my father continued. She's been telling everyone that Emma is marrying into a family with connections to the Pentagon. For the first time in my adult life, my father asked questions about my naval service without any hint of dismissal. He wanted to know about the Fleet Operations Commander responsibilities, about what it meant to coordinate international maritime operations, about the scope of authority that came with my security clearance. When Admiral Thompson called you during dinner, he said, I realized something. You weren't just answering to a boss. You were consulting with a colleague who respected your judgment on matters I couldn't even understand. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. For the first time, my father listened without preparing counter-arguments, asked questions without underlying skepticism, and acknowledged that naval leadership represented achievements far beyond his own professional experience. 2 weeks later, I stood in the Naval Station Norfolk Ceremony Hall where I was officially promoted to Fleet Operations Commander. My entire family was there, along with Robert's parents, Admiral Thompson, and local media covering what the Navy had positioned as a significant leadership appointment. But the moment that mattered most came during the reception. when Charles Whitfield approached Admiral Thompson. "Admiral, I wanted to thank you for helping us understand what Commander Hayes actually does," he said. "We had no idea that naval service involved this level of strategic responsibility." Admiral Thompson smiled. "Mr. Whitfield, Commander Hayes represents the absolute best of modern naval leadership. The Navy doesn't just value her service. We depend on officers like her for our most critical operations. Your son is marrying into a family that's contributed significantly to American maritime security." My father overheard this exchange, and I watched something shift in his expression, pride mixed with a kind of bewildered recognition. 6 months later, Emma and Robert were engaged, with Charles Whitfield proudly announcing to anyone who'd listen that his future daughter-in-law's sister was, quote, one of the Navy's top strategic commanders. My father had become my most enthusiastic advocate, keeping newspaper clippings about naval operations and speculating about whether any of them involved my coordination. Today, I coordinate fleet operations that protect American interests across the Pacific. I brief senior officials on maritime strategy and manage operations, involving thousands of personnel. I've learned that respect isn't something you can argue for. It's something you earn through competence, dedication, and the courage to let your achievements speak for themselves. But more importantly, I've discovered that sometimes the people who love us most need to see us through other people's eyes before they can recognize our worth. Emma found happiness with someone whose family learned to value her strength by association. My father learned to measure success by impact rather than convention. The Navy taught me how to lead sailors. My family taught me how to lead by example. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.